Hello and welcome to Politics and Prose bookstore. My name's Nicole Davidow and I'm an event coordinator here at the store where we're hosting all sorts of events, partnered, supported, trips, classes. For a full list of everything, please go to our website at politics-prose.com. Before we get started, if y'all could just check your phones and make sure they're on silent, it'd be much appreciated. After the conversation today, we will be having a Q&A. If you wouldn't mind lining up at this microphone. We just want to make sure to capture the audio because we are live streaming tonight's event. After the Q&A, we'll have a signing line. You'd be able to pick up a book from one of our fabulous booksellers at the front, and then just line up again here at this white pillar. At the end, we'll also ask that you just fold up your chairs and put them against a sturdy shelf, but I'll remind y'all of that again after the event closes out. So now, without further ado, in partnership with Washington Literacy Center, I'm so thrilled to welcome Elwin Cotman to celebrate the release of his story collection, Weird Black Girls. In each of the 7 stories in this collection, characters pursue their obsessions on paths to glory and destruction, while around them their worlds twist and warp, oscillating between reality and impossibility. Elegiac in tone, imaginative, and humorous in their execution, the character-driven stories in Weird Black Girls challenge, incite, and entertain. Cotman was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where the post-industrial landscape greatly influenced his love for myth and adventure. He is the author of 3 prior collections of speculative short stories, the Jack Daniels Sessions EP, Hard Times Blues, and Dance on Saturday, which was a finalist of the Philip K. Dick Award. Cotman holds a BA from the University of Pittsburgh and an MFA from Mills College. Cotman will be in conversation with Reggie Bailey, the co-founder, executive producer, and co-host of Books Are Pop Culture, the creator of 10 Books, 10 Decades, The Biggest Book Challenge. He is a literary citizen who believes that books should occupy the same space in our cultural lexicon as film, television, music, video games, and fashion. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the stage Cotman and Bailey.
Hey DC, how's it going? Good to see you out tonight.
Good evening. Good evening. Thank you for another night choosing books. That's always amazing. Glad to see you. And Elwin, we're gonna start with reading, or
If that's okay. Being in DC, I grew up in Montgomery County, went to Sherwood High School in Sandy Spring, and I spent some time after college around DC, so it makes me think a lot about my youth and things that went on back then, a while ago at this point. So I wanted to read the title story, which is a real sort of coming of age story. And I don't want to give too much preamble, so I think I'm just going to read the first 5 pages of Weird Black Girls. Bostonians like to say their town, when no more than a straw and timber fishing colony along the verdant opal of the bay, was so pretty the moon wanted to give it a kiss. That had always been my favorite explanation for why, in 1702, the settlement and miles of land leading towards it rose like a finger pointing skyward, to fix at a 45-degree angle above the earth, a monumental divorce of the planet from itself that left the surrounding lands rocky and uninhabitable for decades afterward. This phenomena proved pivotal for the American Revolution, when inaccessible Boston became a key base for colonial operations, as well as a rallying symbol for the Redcoats who, notably proud of their sun-drenched empire, refused to let this ragtag army of tobacco farmers deny them the added tan of a city in the sky. At first I mistook Boston for a patch of stubborn leaves shining greenly among the autumn maples, as our Amtrak twisted through acred woods, the rails screeching underfoot. I was 25. You had been 20 for a month. Reclined in the seat across from you, I'd spent Friday morning in a mixed state of introspection, anxiety, and admiration for the cedar-shingled cabins, the deer cantering within russet leaves beyond our window. At 11:30, I was reading a captivatingly masturbatory Rolling Stone article, written by some Brooklyn white woman about her heroin addiction and other self-made problems, when you said, There it is. Excitedly, I gazed out the window. That first glimpse of Boston did violence to the imagination. For several beats, my brain denied the existence of what I clearly saw from a distance, stretching the length of my arm, a leaning pillar of metamorphic rock. Neighborhoods crept along the surface of America's highest city like gray and red fungi. I saw downtown skyscrapers shining like crystals and, squinting, thought I could make out Fenway Park upholstered somewhere along the center of the incline. The Charles River extended for a mile or so off the ledge before turning to blue mist. With every passing moment, I grew to accept the wondrous calamity as a part of my universe, denial replaced by a gluttonous desire to stuff as much of it as I could down my insufficient eyeballs. My gaze repelled down Boston's earthen flank to several hundred feet of vegetation and mud. Then, gazing up to where the city disappeared in the clouds, I pictured ruinous, deoxygenated Cambridge, where 18th century poets claimed angels soared through the bone-cracking cold, where they said the city's ungravity trash clustered until it gained sentience to go manhunting. I imagined the hidden harbor with blazing lampposts to dispel the eternal shadow on the water, the vacuum-powered tubes that carried goods to the city. You rose on your knees to take pictures with your Polaroid disposable. God, you looked cute. We shared awe and excitement, our hearts shredding a guitar solo as our minds, unmoored from thoughts of past or future, sang anticipation for the unknown. You threw both hands over your heart. It really does look like a penis. I hear it's a fine upstanding city, I replied. California had the gold rush, Massachusetts had the blood rush. The best joke I could manage on short notice. When you refused to reward me, not even with annoyance, I pressed on. I heard the witch Annalee used sex magic to make the earth orgasm, then it just stuck that way. Everything's sex with you, you replied, pissing me off at your blatant falsehood. Had I not been a gentleman, had I not asked, may I, every step of the way? But you had taught me that girls, afraid to be thought unequal partners, like to play games with their lovers. I forgave you since I understood your reasons, however disappointing. Empathy looked better on you than insecure bullying. I'm talking sex magic, I retorted. A black tradition. Look up Obeah. I had an aunt my family thought was a witch, you mused, tilting at your waist to snap an ankle picture. It turned out she had a mental illness. I laughed out loud, a touch theatrical. When was this, the 50s? Nuh-uh, this was recent, you said in fake indignation that made your soft, high voice nearly squeak. I adored that voice. To me, that voice was more than shower water off a woman's shoulders, or the liquid black eyes of a doe, or a pair of feet squeezed into pumps and elevated off the earth, the most feminine thing I'd ever encountered. On the other hand, your words concerned me. Here we were, interesting, educated people on adventure. The reminder that you descended from sexist, superstitious, sweet Mother Mary, I do believe in spirits, bog standard black folks was a bad portent. It made me want to talk more on the subject, to hear you renounce your family's beliefs. But since I didn't want to upset you, I said nothing. I hadn't always been passive. Back in 3rd grade, my parents sent me to a suburban Catholic school where I grew sick of the racist, unexceptional kids and fanatical teachers. To get expelled, I concocted and executed a plan wherein, during the Christmas pageant, in which I donned a shiny metallic poncho as one of the stars standing against the curtain, not even the Star of Bethlehem, that had been a 1st grader named Ebony, who grew up to serve time in Muncie for impersonating a tax collector. I stuck my hand down my crotch and yawned loudly for the entire hour. For some reason, the nuns didn't hook me off stage, let alone expel me, so I suppose you could call my mission a failure. But I found it hard to reconcile that confidently sinister child with the man I'd become. Just the other day, I called out a barista for giving me incorrect change. The rush of accomplishment I felt when she slipped that dollar bill into my palm either encouraging or humiliating. I hadn't yet decided. Someday, I hoped, when bravery came easier, such moments would feel less special. After all, I had the courage to woo you. You were weird. Gloriously weird. Not quirky, as some called you. That's a nice word for dumb. You were a soft-spoken, light-hearted black girl into giallo horror and mysticism, who texted me at 1 in the morning to let me know you were tripping Robitussin with your white girl roommates, prone to awkward rambling and sardonic asides that sounded innocent from your lips. That morning you'd gone on about the devil. How fascinating, you said, that he collects souls through backdoor deals and yet can possess people as well. You thought it was kind of sexy he rebelled against God. Blasphemy. Before quietly admitting that you didn't believe in heaven or hell. Sweet baby Jesus, that girl must think she white. Though I'd have loved to discuss Baphomet's various incarnations all the way to Boston, you had such trouble maintaining conversation that you went quiet, and the way that a desert was sometimes quiet. I suppose this made sense. A 2-day ride in the pinnacle of transcontinental luxury travel would exhaust anyone's verbosity. I'll stop there, thank you.
And I'm glad you did that reading, because I know we were speaking a little bit back there, like, oh, this is what I would try to do. But now, because you've done the reading, you've actually kind of adjusted the plan that I had, because you actually touched on a quote I wanted to ask you about, and I really liked it, which is the the difference between being weird and quirky, right? I thought that was really interesting, especially considering the collection is called Weird Black Girls, right? So I wanted to ask, what is it about weird, right? That's I guess the better word to use as opposed to quirky. Like, is how would that, I guess, make that story different, perhaps, if you were to call it like quirky black girls as opposed to weird? Like, can you just talk about maybe what your narrator is getting at when he says
Um,
that?
well, the narrator is, I guess, oh man, I'm sort of looking and now I'm analyzing the character. I feel like quirky is probably a word that that his love interest would call herself, whereas he zeroes in on the idea of weirdness. The title itself, Weird Black Girls, this is a story about two people who are in a relationship and then they go on a trip after they've broken up, which is, of course, not a good idea, but that's what they do. And so much of him just sort of idolizing her and looking at this as, this is a person who I want to date, a woman from the tribe, right? I want somebody who understands what I'm going through and all the joys and the pains. And I also want a person who I feel like we're sort of on the same vibe, uh, intellectually, emotionally. And this idea of weirdness is almost a sort of currency for black people, where it's like, oh, if we're thought of as weird, that actually means we're non-threatening and we can have access to certain spaces. And the fact that even though it can gain you access to those spaces, that doesn't erase your blackness, right? And it doesn't automatically make things easier, and it doesn't automatically make their relationship, a walk in the park. And so I think like the term weird as opposed to the term quirky. I do go on TikToks and stuff, and I do see the term quirky black girl come up a lot. And this is, of course, from uh, young man's perspective, and he zeroes in on that word weird.
Yeah, no, it kind of made me think like, all right, maybe I'll say weird when I'm describing someone and see if it goes better than if I say quirky, right? But yeah, I do like also just the thought experiment that it kind of made me had, that quote. And I appreciate you sharing your thoughts. And something that you just said in your answer was how your narrator wanted to date someone within the tribe, right? Which I understand and relate to. And it's interesting when you consider the collection as a whole and you consider like I'll say relations and or relationships across like racial lines, right? And could you talk a little bit more about just what you were, I guess, what work you were doing throughout the collection in terms of just relationships within and outside of the tribe?
Well, I'm not going to pretend like I went into this collection with a real cohesive idea of what I wanted in there. I offered Scribner all the short stories I had, and there were a few that didn't make it in. There's a story about Ja Rule fleeing to Mars on a yacht that didn't make it into the final one, and that was also a love story, by the way. It's him and a Prince hologram, and they hang out and talk about things. But but I do think there is that theme that's emerged. Maybe just that's where I am in my life, where yeah, there's a story about a father and a son, right? And then there's a story about a boyfriend and a boyfriend, and then that's the relationship that we're watching in real time, and then there's another story about a man and a woman that we're watching after the relationship has ended. And then there's a story about a little girl and her love for her father, her brother, right? So I feel like that definitely emerged, and I was looking at all the different types of relationships that people could have with each other, and definitely filtering that through a lens of black joy and the comfort that can be found in being amongst other black people. Even though I feel it's a pretty dark collection, I think I always wanted to come back to that. Um, yeah.
Oh, understood. And speaking of darkness, right? One of the reasons why you might say that is because whether it's racial violence, wrestling, what I would call maybe like public death when you think of just the police shootings of unarmed black people, or even there's even a moment where there's an art piece where like the guillotine is kind of like glorified, right? There is plenty said about violence as entertainment, about violence even as a fear tactic or even a preventative measure when you think about the reasons for grabbing a switch from the switching tree,
Hmm.
right? And can you speak a bit about the role, the various roles that you wanted violence to play in Weird Black Girls?
Well, I definitely think I was writing it at a time. We can't ignore the historical moment. That all these visions of black people being murdered are transported. And all across the internet. And I remember I didn't watch any of the videos. Like I didn't watch George Floyd get murdered. I didn't
I
want to
haven't
see
seen
that.
it either. Yeah.
But I definitely think that was on my mind as far as okay, well, having to know that your life is not valued in this country and knowing that, it can be taken from you at any moment. And that anxiety filters down to the characters. But then also realizing, as I'm working on these pieces, that this is not a new anxiety. You talked about, there's two stories in the collection that actually deal with corporal punishment, spanking your children. And this idea that if you can make your children act correctly, that will somehow keep white supremacists from hurting them, which is nonsense, right? But it's an idea that people have to convince themselves is true so that they can go to sleep at night and feel that their children are safe. Like I did what I could to protect them. So for me, looking at the different types of violence, I never want to say the same thing in subsequent stories, and I never want a story to sort of be from the same perspective. So there's a story in there that's from the white perspective, looking at the death of a black person, and I definitely don't view maybe when I was, writing my first couple books, there were lots of head explosions and that type of thing, and I think, there's a time and place for that. But this particular book, I'm not looking at violence as entertainment. It's very much like what is the effect that violence has on people, particularly people who like they don't lead violent lives. Like a lot of the characters in the book are just normal folks trying to get through the day, and
No, understood. Understood. And you talked about how there are two stories that touch on corporal punishment, and one I spoke about, which is the switching tree. The other one is Owen. And with Owen, I actually wanted to kind of nerd out a little bit about that with you, if possible, because when when you were like recapping, it was actually a kind of a fateful night. I don't know if anyone in here is familiar with Owen Hart. the wrestler.
His
But yeah,
birthday was Tuesday, I think. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Dang, I didn't even know that. But yeah, it's that's something I'll just let you Google, right? But tragedy struck, unfortunately, and it was at King of the Ring. I believe that was '98. I think, or '99, or maybe it was
He
over the
died at
edge.
Over the
Over
Edge
the
in
edge, yeah.
St. Louis. So I
Yeah.
think that was a little bit like maybe like late spring of '99,
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And thank you for that too. And it was interesting when you were like just kind of recapping in that story some of like wrestling from the time. I actually remember living through it. You were talking about Stone Cold losing the title. When I'm thinking of King of the Ring, I'm thinking of like the first blood match, I believe,
First
with
blood
Kane,
match, yeah.
and then also Undertaker versus Mankind, Hell in the Cell, right? And I just kind of wanted to ask, was that something that you've always been into, or was that something kind of like you came across like while researching that story? What's the story with like the wrestling and Owen? And yeah,
I'm a huge professional wrestling fan. Me and my little sister used to watch Live Wire was the show. It was like their Saturday morning show.
yeah,
So that guy's watching Monday Night Raw. And it's so funny. I found a ticket in my dad's bathroom back when he still lived in Pittsburgh, and it was to King of the Ring '98, which we were at. We were in the nosebleeds, um, which is weird watching Mankind get thrown off the cage from the note because like he just vanished, right? Like everybody, like on the other side, they saw him fall through the table, like 20 feet through a table. It just looked like he vanished into a vortex from where we were sitting. But it says, like WWF King of the Ring presented by Super Soaker at the Civic Arena. WWF doesn't exist anymore. Super Soaker, I don't think, is a thing anymore. The Civic Arena is now the Mellon Arena. Everything is sort of turned over. But, it was a form of art that I sort of gleaned onto where, you're telling all these cool stories, but you're also following athletes' careers as they go forward, and you can see them have the ups and the downs, and you can appreciate the work they're doing. You can appreciate them both as people portraying characters and as just very talented artists. Somebody like Owen Hart, right, who was a great technical wrestler, but also a great performer and a great character performer. And I, I'm trying to think. I think it was the image of the funeral, and I can go on a bit more about that story. But we always had hamsters who would die. You know, when I was a kid, and my dad would actually have funerals for them, and I just sort of gleaned on that idea of, "Oh, I guess I'm spoiling things, but how do we lead kids through grief, especially grief that they internalize to a point, but also it's sort of like the prelude to higher griefs they might feel. And I do think Owen Hart's death was probably my first experience with mortality. I can't think of anything prior to that, where I'm like, oh, this is the end for someone, and watching people mourn like they were on WWF TV the day after he died. Um,
no, I relate to that too because like I guess me mourning, I'll say someone who I don't know, right, but someone who I followed, like their career. Steve McNair, who was a quarterback for the Tennessee Titans and the
mm,
Baltimore Ravens. That was one of the first times where I kind of felt like what you're describing there. So no, I relate exactly to what you're talking about. And wanted to also talk about loneliness, right? There's this really, really cool quote that you have, right? And it stuck out to me, and I'll share why. There was nothing in this world lonelier than a lonely black person. Small wonder then that we bought into God, devils, and portents. Otherwise, there was nothing to believe in but yourself and the several billion loaded guns pointed your way. And this passage, just stopped me in my tracks because I've been doing a lot of reading lately about like the impact that technology has on us, particularly like social media and just tons of screen time, right, and things of that nature. And it it always, like, whenever you read these stories or
mm,
just about this, it tends to lead to loneliness. and it just talks about how people are lonelier than they've ever been, despite having access to more information and tools than ever before. And when you specifically talked about being lonely and black, I thought about this idea where, like, when America catches a cold, some people say black people catch the flu. Some people even say black people catch pneumonia, right?
Mm.
And I never thought of loneliness as a thing to exacerbate the same way, right, that we say a flu is, right, or a cold is. And could you talk a little bit about, just what you were getting at in that quote, which also came from We're Black Girls?
Well, it's I do think a lot of the stories in this collection do deal with loneliness. Fair amount of them were written. I was living out in Colorado, and didn't have too many friends. uh, but I was teaching at the time and sort of putting a lot of effort into finding spaces where I could feel welcome, like writing workshops and stuff like that. So I definitely think there's a certain level of autobiography in there. But I also, loneliness is a valid emotion. And for me, like I said, I just don't want to always repeat the same sort of beats in subsequent stories. So there are stories about people who are in relationships but are still feeling a certain level of loneliness or a certain level of distance from their partner. And there's stories about people who, they're very much striving to be in social spaces, but at the end of the day, they still have to be alone in some capacity. Um, and there's a story about somebody in an abusive relationship, right? And the type of seclusion that comes there when the person you love mistreats you, right? So I do think, as far as the idea of it as in relation to blackness, I mean, I think you pretty much hit the nail on the head, where it's it exacerbates all the other things that are happening. And for me, it's always like my strength has always been with other black people, right? And times where I feel isolated from other black people, it's like, okay, it feels a bit more anxious, right? And I definitely think that the book explores that to a certain extent, but also there's points in the book where I do want to celebrate the social aspect, but also acknowledging the social aspect, going to parties, going to church, hang out with your friends. At the end of the day, you're not going to be with them 24/7. So,
And you walked into another quote that I have here. I appreciate that. Um, Nothing is more important than play. It carries us from birth to death, which comes from one of the. I'm going to pull up the title here because I have to say it. It's one of the longest story titles. Things I Never Learned in Caitlin Clark's Intro to Acting Class. I love the title, by the way, too.
thank
And when I hear that quote, I do think of some of the stuff I talked about earlier, like the wrestling, and then when I think of even, in the switching tree, where the narrator does want to like play with the boys and all that, and then also even in, it's the intro to acting class, right? So acting as a form of play, and I also think about just how you genre hop,
you.
right? Like you'll write whatever seems to move you and interest you, even if it's like fantastical, speculative, whatever. And I kind of want to know, what does that quote mean to you, as well as the life you think that quote lives throughout your collection.
I mean, for me, play is a type of transcendence, and I think people find it in different ways. Some people find it in acting. Some people find it in LARPing. Some people find it in church, religion, philosophy, these sorts of things. But looking for something that is not just who you are in your everyday life, and looking for something greater, I feel play has a definite part in that. Um, which is why so many religious ceremonies involve masks, right? Going before the gods is something greater than yourself. And I've always sort of gleaned into that as play is something that's necessary. We do it all day long. We don't even think about it. We go on Facebook and pretend to be somebody we're not. it's an aspect of play, right? You only show the best version of yourself or the version of yourself that you want people to see. And I think that very much came out in my book because I feel like play is something that comes out, but it manifests in different ways, right? So there's elements of sexual play, right, that come out. Um, Not as many as happened in my last story collection, but to a fair bit, right? But there's also the idea of spanking is a form of theater, and it's the only form of theater, I guess, that I'm aware of that parents are sanctioned to do, right? Where it's like the other one is Santa Claus, and the idea of putting together this whole pageantry of torment in order to prove a point to your children and thus protect them, right? So that's a form of play, and the sort of character arc for that character, not to get into spoilers, but it's sort of like finding his own form of play as opposed to the one that was bequeathed to him by his father, right? And I feel it's a necessary thing. We can't constantly be in ourselves just absorbing the world that people tell us is this world and how people behave and how you're supposed to behave. We have to search for that higher, right? And play is intrinsic to that, whether you're LARPing, whether you're acting, whether you're having sex or spanking your children, right? It comes out because it's absolutely necessary.
And I guess what I'll do, I think I could squeeze in maybe a couple more because based on what you just said, squeeze in a couple more questions, then we'll open it up to anyone else who has questions. So the first thing I wanted to ask, based on your answer you just provided, is about this other quote. This also from Caitlin Clark's, intro to acting class. Lately, I've been fashioning my life into rebellion against America's obsession with hustling, grinding, whatever they call it these days. When people ask what I do, I refer to myself as a bum who smokes too many cigarettes and recreationally, see my autocorrect, sorry about that, recreationally reads essays on Ralph Ellison. And the quote goes on. And I wanted you to talk about just some of your thoughts on like hustle culture, right? Because what you were saying about play, I mean, I think I play a version of myself definitely when I go to work. I mean, one could argue I'm playing a version of myself right now, right?
Mhm.
And could you just talk about, what comes to mind when you hear that quote and what the narrator of Caitlin Clark's intro to acting class was getting at?
Funny thing, he says he recreationally smokes too many cigarettes. Character doesn't smoke a single cigarette in that whole story. He's just not a smoker. I should have probably taken that out or included a smoking scene. But but the story takes place in 2009, and I always try and include as many period details as I can. And I remember at that point, there was a lot of just focusing on hustle. You need to have 3 jobs. You need to have all the gigs, right? Else you're lazy and you're not moving forward. And of course, at this period of, what the economy crashed in 2008, and that was sort of the start of the media going into this narrative like, oh, millennials are lazy, they're entitled, they got too many trophies when they were kids, it's extremely tired. And if you keep up with tropes, you know um, very sort of race coded way they were saying, like, oh, you're shiftless, you're lazy, that's they were talking about blacks and Mexicans this way during the early 20th century. Now they're talking about their own children this way, right? And it was a trap. It was a trap, and it was gaslighting. And the particular character, I think the fun part of engaging with that character is this is somebody who was hustling for a long time and just got burnt out on it, and now has a space to engage with love. It's a love story, right? And one thing that I'm happy about, I see the idea of rejecting that hustle culture and rejecting that sort of self-immolation, that sort of guilt that you're not generating enough capital is something that a lot of people younger than me have thoroughly rejected. Um, and they talk about like quiet quitting, right? AKA doing what you're actually contracted to do and not, what they tell you to do, right? And that's normalized now. Um, so I think putting that in Caitlin Clark is sort of looking at the historical moment and thinking, okay, this is the moment that led to it being now normalized, realizing that your bosses don't care about you. They're the ones who want you out there dying during a pandemic so long as you're just generating money and they're making billions of dollars and everybody's aware of that now. So,
Yeah. And another one fittingly from that same story, right? Or another thought. There's a reference to Troy from Fences, and I know that you're from Pittsburgh,
mhm.
and August Wilson is also from Pittsburgh, and I was just curious, since you know there is a story about like acting and theater in there. What type of role or influence did August Wilson have on this work, as well as just maybe your art in general, since you are a native of Pittsburgh?
I've read a few of Wilson's poems. I read them as adults. So as an adult. So I didn't he wasn't really a literary influence for me, once I was coming up and sort of, germinating my sort of my list of authors who were influencing me. But in Pittsburgh his work is just, in the water and you're experiencing it whether or not you read it, right? And he is definitely, the predominant voice as far as that city. And so I'm not gonna say, I was taking from him directly, but I do always keep him in the back of my head, right? I was actually I won a this is a digression. I won a poetry contest when I was a kid, where it was a it was an advertisement for Java Sonata coffee. So I had to write about coffee, and I think maybe they put the poem on the bag or something. It was just like a corporate thing. I won first and second place, and August Wilson was a judge. So I always keep that in the back of my mind that he read my stuff and he thought it was good. But we never met, unfortunately.
Hey, y'all been each other's work though. So no, that is awesome. And yeah, I guess I'll open it up if any questions, and if not, I have more. So,
Hi. Uh, this is a very specific question. If it does not interest you, it's okay to be like, no, it's fine. So this Caitlin Clark story takes place in 2009. So it's obviously not about the basketball player. Was there a point in the past like year or so where you were like, oh, there's this other Caitlin Clark?
I am aware of the basketball player. Their names are spelled differently though. So um, yeah, that's cool. I don't know. It's a common name.
Fair enough. Yeah.
I noticed this Mark had it easy.
Yeah.
So I also was watching live when Owen Hart passed away, and I never thought of it till you said it, but it really was a traumatic moment. Like, and the first time I really thought about mortality, and it was probably like that for an entire generation of kids of a certain age. But my real question is, so I had to buy the book because first of all, the cover is amazing, and
Thank you.
second, it had blurbs on it by two of my favorite writers, Karen Russell and Kelly Link, and I was wondering if you consider your work to be in conversation with theirs and writers like them at all.
Certainly. Um, so Karen Russell, I look at Karen Russell as sort of she's the Madonna of literary fantasy, which, by the way, continuing the analogy, makes Helen Oyeyemi the Janet Jackson of literary fantasy. But Karen Russell has been so good for so long that nobody even thinks about why she's good, right? She first came out when she was 25 or something. And what always stood out to me about Karen's work is the language, her exact use of verbs or doing something creative with the adjectives. Every single sentence has something you can glean onto. And I did read, St. Lucy's, and I definitely think that's her writing has always sort of been in the back of my mind since her work came out. Somebody who is not only conceptually creative, but just an amazing linguist. And Kelly published my last story collection, and her book Magic for Beginners was also one that was very important to me when I first started writing urban fantasy, where just knowing that something could be done, right? I'm never going to write like Kelly Link. Most people are never going to write like Kelly Link. Her mind goes places that, you can't teach it, right? But seeing that she was able to write, a story like Stone Rabbits, right? Or a story like the Fairy Handbag, right? Where just seeing she's a person who sort of taught me that you can push fantasy farther. And I read about elves and wizards and whatnot, like I read Dragonlance and things like that when I was a kid. But seeing the new dimensions she added was very inspiring to me. They're both great writers, and yeah, I salute them. I'm a fan as well.
So your stories, as you mentioned, are very rooted in certain time periods. They're rooted in time, but then deal with themes that sort of transcend that temporality at the same time. Can you talk about sort of how you came to strike that balance, or why you decided to place them in such certain periods of time?
I do. The collection, most of the stories take place within the last, I want to say, 25 years, which makes sense. I'm sort of pulling from my own experiences. But one thing that I like about going into the past is that it does sort of enable me to enter a more fable-like space. So I think that's fortunate for something like the Switchin' Tree, where I ask myself, okay, could a character actually walk from the swamp outside Fort Pierce to Fort Pierce and go to a movie theater? Probably not, right? But who actually has a record of that? So I'm I can sort of enter that fairy tale space, which helps if I'm writing, sort of a dark fantasy like the Switching Tree is. Um, but the idea of time, I think I'm very much drawn to specific moments, right? Like Triggered is about the moment after Occupy Oakland, in Oakland, and sort of taking apart, looking very closely at the nuts and bolts of a specific time and place has always been very appealing to me. So whenever I'm doing that, if I'm doing something especially that's more clear in living memory, then I always want to be as specific as I can and just be very true to the time and place.
This is more of a technical question, but what's your like writing process like when coming up with the stories? Do you come up with the outline, or do you have like a general theme idea? Like, what's the general like step to step basis? I guess. Yeah.
I usually start off with concepts, and then I do concepts, and then I do character. So I'm like, okay, there's a cool thing that I would like to try, and then I think, what person would I like to explore? What imaginary person? So I put them in there, and I'm trying to give you something more specific because I feel like I'm being vague, and that's not good. It's not good when I could actually be helpful. Maybe if I broke down a specific story. Um, Caitlin Clark was I'm a fan of Tama Janowitz, who's a writer, and I saw a reading of hers done by Caitlin Clark. Caitlin Clark was an actress who was pretty substantial for me. She was the first genderqueer character who I saw in a movie, the movie Dragon Slayer, and it's all in the story, right? But I'm like, okay, the universe is now calling me to do something that combines these disparate ideas. And how did I get the idea for this specific fantasy concept in that work? God, I can't even tell. Some stuff just comes, but once the synergy is there, I feel things start to coalesce, and from there, I just start free writing in a journal. So I write maybe 4 hours a day, and it's hard for me to write on the laptop new stuff because there's that illusion of permanence that just like messes me up. Example: There's a Go-Go's album that I reference in that particular story. I write head over heels, right? The name of the record is Talk Show. Years, draft after draft after draft, that mistake stayed in there. And I'm convinced it's because I put it in italics, so it looks official. Very obvious mistake. Head Over Heels was a lead single, not the name of the record. So I don't write new stuff on the computer. I just write it longhand and just see where things guide me, I guess. Hello, sir.
Hi. I have a question about your formation as a writer.
Yes, sir.
You first mentioned writing poetry. When you talked about August Wilson, you mentioned that he's a poet, and he's first and foremost a poet.
He's a playwright.
Yeah, he is. But he is. The bottom line is that he's a poet.
Mm-hmm.
When did you know that you would write?
I was 4 years old. My mother had a word processor, and no, because I started on a typewriter. I was born during the Cold War. Like I've been around a little bit. So we didn't have a word processor to start with. We had a typewriter, and it was fun writing on typewriters because if I made a mistake, you couldn't correct it. So you just have to go and this is the reason why this guy's name changed is because he went and did this. Like I was so excited when I bought a word processor, when my mom bought a word processor, and I could actually correct mistakes. Blew my mind, but I knew then. And it's been, an education that continues, and I graduate when I die, But there hasn't been a lot of doubt. Now the doubt is about what type of stories do I write? Is this a TV pilot? Is this a screenplay? Is this a poem? Is this a short story? But writing stories, I've been at this for a while.
And speaking of that too, according to the interwebs, right? It does say that you have a novel coming
Yes.
out next year. What are you able to say about The Age of Innocence?
I am quite hyped about it.
Nice.
It's a love story between two friends. Two friends who are they moved to the Bay in 2008, year Obama was elected. But anybody who knows their history, kind of a tumultuous time in the Bay, right? Certain things that happened then, and it's about the love they have for each other, because that's something that one of those topics that I wanted to write a novel about, which is black male friendship, which is something that has been, just extremely important in my life. And I had a story in my last collection called Seven Watsons, which the entire point of the story was black male friendship. And you can read it however you want, right? But every single thing that happens in that story is for that purpose. It's about celebrating the love between black men. And as soon as I wrote that, I'm like, I need to write a novel about this. I need to push this forward. So it's a buddy comedy, I suppose. Lots about going to parties and
playing
and play, yeah. Lots of trash talking, long sections of trash talking. Might have to cut that down or make it longer. We'll see. Starting my edits in June. So
you need to definitely get your copy of Where Black Girls Dance on Saturday, Age of Innocence next year. So yeah.
If there are no more final questions, thank you both so much. This was truly wonderful. A really great conversation.
thank you. Thank you for coming out.
Please make sure to grab a copy from one of our fabulous booksellers at the checkout line for yourself, for a friend, for a family member, and we'll have the signing line starting right